Our reading this morning comes from Richard Schwartz from the book No Bad Parts. What if each of us and each of our parts contains a piece of a greater self, with a capital S, that longs to reconnect with itself? What if, by helping parts unburden and trusting ourself and feeling our connectedness with other people, to the planet, and to a greater self, we are serving this larger project of divine reconnection? I think this is what internal family systems offers spiritual seekers. Our enlightenment is much brighter and more sustained if all of us are involved, and we don't treat an individual aspect of ourselves as a bad part we have to leave behind in the dust on the way to attaining that enlightenment. Our parts long for connection to ourself, just as we long for connection to something larger than ourselves. Schwartz continues, when people spend time exploring their family system inside, they all come to the same conclusion, that this essential self is who we really are. Says Schwartz, I think that what is often called awakening or enlightenment is the embodied realization of that fact. That shift from identifying with your parts and their burdens to identifying with the higher self. And that has profound implications. What we are talking about transcends any particular religion or philosophy and doesn't even require that you believe in something spiritual, just that you come to accept that there is this beautiful essence in you and everyone else. Spontaneous aspects of this higher self emerge as we cease to identify with our parts and their burdens and begin to identify with the true inner self. These qualities include curiosity, calmness, confidence, creativity, clarity, and courage, connectedness, and compassion. Considering each one of these qualities will make you feel more connected to humanity. And when people sense how connected they are to humanity, they feel more curious about others and have more courage to help them. Compassion as a spontaneous aspect of self blew my mind because I'd always assumed and learned that compassion was something you had to develop. There's this idea, especially in many spiritual circles, that you have to build up the muscle of compassion over time because it's not inherent. Again, that's the negative view on human nature at play. To be clear, what I mean by compassion is the ability to be in the self with somebody when they're really hurting and feel for them, but not be overburdened by their pain. You can only do that if you've done it within yourself. That is, if you can be with your own exiles without blending and being overwhelmed by them, and instead show them compassion and help them, then you can do the same for someone in pain who's sitting across from you. Back to Barbie. Ken, in the movie, says to Barbie, I just don't know who I am without you. I only exist within the warmth of your gaze. And Barbie responds, maybe it's time to discover who Ken really is. You have to figure out who you are without me. Richard Schwartz would say it is time to figure out who we really are, who is our true self, without all of our burdened parts.
I'm Pac Matthews. My public part presents as a white male, bespeckled. Pronouns are he, him. According to the program, I'm a part that's crashing this service. So, I don't know if this was planned, but you get to practice accepting, having compassion for this part that just has to get up and speak. I was really asked to do this. Our internal family systems are embedded in a larger ecosystem of relationships, kinship networks, communities of friendship, as well as culture. There isn't anything much more complex than a culture. Whether it's the culture that brews our beer, digests our lunch, or the human culture that influences what options we have for meaning in our lives. It's often said among my fellow entrepreneurs that culture eats strategy for lunch. Our literal lunch is literally eaten by culture, the culture of our gut biome. So it's not surprising that the culture that emerges in an organization calls a lot of the shots. Systems thinking, the larger idea of systems thinking of which internal family systems is a subset you could think of, initially emerged within the fields of mathematics and computer science back in the 40s, and developed, and then organizational theory picked it up, and some other fields all had their fun with it. It represented a dramatic mid-century paradigm shift that we UUs had already made long ago. Our UU forebears had the courage to step out of the myth of the emotional triangle at the apex of cosmic divinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Since then, we've extended this courage to commit to a non-hierarchical worldview by perceiving and celebrating the interconnected web of all creation. So I invite you to picture in your mind's eye a triangle. Each side is infinitely flexible, like a rubber band, and any relationship you've ever had with another soul, be it human or animal, can be described with such a triangle between you. Let's keep it simple to begin, and place yourself on one corner of the triangle, and a friend, loved one, or a pet on one of the other corners. Now imagine that the third corner of this triangle is inhabited by the version of the relationship that each of you have of the other. If you think about it, unless you're FaceTiming with them every moment of the day, most of your time is spent interacting internally with the facsimile point of that triangle. And then imagine the links between points of the triangle lengthening and contracting in response to whether there's emotional closeness or distance. You can imagine that there could be great physical closeness, but distance emotionally, and vice versa. Emotional closeness between you and someone very distant. Have you ever spent hours arguing with that character, the one on the third point, for hours before making a phone call? Right? You get the picture. If that dynamic isn't complicated enough, then imagine in your mind's eye that there is a similar triangle between you, everyone you know by name, and they have similar triangles spinning out in every direction. The conception of emotional triangles is just one of the many tools in the toolkit of systems thinkers. And in this concept, distance can be emotional and physical, but emotional distance tends to be the more influential variable. Designated leadership, the titles we wear, rarely identifies the individuals with the highest influence in any organization or family. If you can map the emotional triangle systems, you'll have a much better picture of how a family, community, or organization is organized. Culture has a higher leverage than policy, as stated earlier with Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch. And culture may be a description of the homeostasis that emerges from a group. For those of us seeking change, we need to understand and be prepared for the dynamics of resistance, pushback, sabotage, and other means of which a system seems to keep a homeostasis, all of its own. So here's some principles of emotional triangles that you can experiment within your relationships. Emotional cutoff can be creatively and playfully challenged. Listening for who the other party to the triangle thinks they are interacting with is always worthwhile. Recently, in a phone call with my brother, he was trying to convince me of his latest conspiracy theory, and I said, you know, Rob, I'm kind of closed-minded about these things. And he said, yeah, I know, but here. So he didn't try to talk me out of, so I got a really clear picture. He sees me as closed-minded. Triangulation is a real thing, but we can always manage our end of the dynamic through keeping our own self-differentiation strong, keeping our own values clarified, developing our own emotional maturity, and choosing differentiation over fusion or simply tolerance, maintaining healthy boundaries and supporting others as they try to do the same, and then choosing challenge and adventure over comfort in an organization or family life. So once you're aware of the habits of triangulation, you start to see it everywhere. Sometimes you make the choice to insert yourself deeper into a triangle that is seeking to exclude you, and sometimes you are creating greater emotional distance within a triangle that wants you more fused than is healthy for you. Both skill sets can be mastered and deployed. Because of the interconnected nature of yours and my networks of emotional triangles, making your own emotional triangle healthy is the best contribution that you can make to mine. The best news for the planet to come out of the world of systems thinking is that even our smallest efforts ripple and propagate in all directions and have an impact on the universe, tickle the toes of future generations on the beach. Systems thinkers who examined complex manufacturing systems have discovered that idleness is not a sin. Goodbye grind culture, hello nap ministry.
Hi, I'm Larry Lile, a white-haired guy with skin the color of pine sapwood. He, him pronouns, with full beard, wearing a black t-shirt that says, "Break the stigma of mental health issues." So, here to speak about internal family systems therapy as spiritual practice. Much of this comes from a recent book by Richard Schwartz called No Bad Parts. Richard Schwartz is the discoverer of internal family systems therapy. I'm not going to say inventor, I'm going to say discoverer. Discovering an internal map of our minds. He's by far not the only proponent of this approach to healing the human mind. Schwartz is a professional counselor, author of a number of books for professionals, seminars, and recently his work, No Bad Parts, is aimed toward a lay audience. Now, pitching internal family systems therapy as spiritual practice was a tough sell. I feel like I'm pitching colonoscopy prep as spiritual practice. It's okay for you to be skeptical about my premise that this therapeutic model of the brain can be spiritual. In fact, that skepticism is a part of you with a capital P, part with a capital P. There's nothing wrong with your skeptical part. Your skeptical part is not bad or unwanted. This part is trying to protect you. Thank your skeptical part for its role in keeping you from being duped by yet another April Fool's joke. I have no doubt your skeptical part will raise many objections to what I have to say in the next few minutes. That's great. But I'm asking you to sit aside from your skeptical part just a little bit. Reassure it. You'll listen to it just a little bit later. Sit it over there on the bench for a while. Let it yell a few heckling comments from the sidelines if that makes it feel better. I think this is all BS. Now that your skeptical part has taken a seat on the bench, I'll tell you something else that will stretch your credulity. I'm a 66-year-old man, And despite that advanced age, I'm going to tell you about my imaginary friend. I had a lot of imaginary friends when I was a child. A lot of them were kind of based on cartoon characters. Some of them were good, but some of them were bad. Today, I'd like you to meet my imaginary friend, Rita. Rita sits here on my knee and is curious about the world. Rita's maybe 4 years old and much more in touch with various processes in my body than I actually am. I first met Rita during a brief meditation after being introduced to internal family systems. In a meditation in the book, Schwartz invites us to relax and focus inward, to become aware of thoughts, feelings, emotions within our body. I became aware of a churning and burning feeling in my stomach. I've suffered from heartburn and gastric reflux for years, had taken all kinds of pills that don't work. It's kept me up late at night, has all kinds of complications. So I was aware of this churning and gurgling energy within my body. Schwartz encourages us to be curious about these, quote, trailheads. These are signposts that might spark our curiosity. As I explored this uncomfortable energy, Schwartz has encouraged me to consider this trailhead as a part. The churning energy was almost pre-verbal. It was stuck in a past memory of being bullied by other children, but then not receiving comfort and reassurance from its parents. These are difficulties it could just barely fathom. All it really wanted to do was sit on its parents' knee and have a book read to it. I decided to call this part Rita, for read a book to me. After discovering Rita, we had a sort of conversation. I asked Rita what it had to do with this churning gastric reflux energy. And it said, oh, I can just turn that off. Rita just turned off the gastric reflex, just turned it off like that. Sometimes the heartburn comes back a little. When it does, I ask Rita what's wrong. Rita says, you're tired, you're thirsty, you're hot, you're hungry, and you haven't paid attention to anything in your body in a long time. And as soon as I pay attention to those things and take care of those needs, heartburn's gone. Rita used to carry the burden of gastric reflux and heartburn, and also the burden of wanting to feel love from its parent. Now that she's unburdening, I can provide that parental love to this part of me from my own internal self. Rita can now, unburdened from those things, can be in charge of play. Play with me. My inner self can provide love for this inner child, a child that felt it did not receive parental love earlier. Rita's one of my parts. Rita carried a simple burden. When Rita feels love coming from myself, she can be unburdened from this load. Under internal family systems model, everyone's personality is composed of parts. Each of these parts can be like an entire individual, an entire personality, even containing its own parts. Its parts all the way down. Schwartz was treating patients in the 1980s that suffered from multiple personality disorder. I think they call it something different now. But anyway, and standard practice at the time was to deny these extra personalities and say, well, that's not really you. You're this other guy over here. And this was frustratingly ineffective. Schwartz began to treat each personality that expressed itself in his patients as an individual deserving of respect, the inherent worth and dignity of every part, and began to find that each one had its own psychology and its own driving internal stresses and traumas. And then began to realize that each of us has this potential within us, not to the difficult degree of some of his patients, but this potential to have different parts of us expressed actually works within everyone. I was quite skeptical about these ideas at first. There's a part of me that is suspicious of any kind of New Age woo-woo. A skeptical part that just wants to focus on practical ideas. I asked that skeptical part to stand aside for a little while, and the result was discovering Rita. Rita can turn off gastric reflux, a very practical result. My inner skeptic decided we were onto something here. So I just watched the Barbie movie. Anybody else watching the Barbie movie with me? Okay. A lot of people are abuzz about it. And one of the topics of conversation is, which Barbie doll am I most like? Or Ken, or Alan. There's only one Alan. But the viewer soon realizes in this pink Pinocchio allegory where the doll wants to become real, that they themselves are like multiple Barbies. They resonate with multiple individuals in this doll family with unrealistic hip-to-waist ratios. But who is playing with the Barbie dolls? Who is the observer pretending to be Avon representative Barbie, copyright 1999, or the observer riffing marine biologist Barbie, copyright 2012, playing out a fantasy? A child playing with dolls can be completely absorbed, channeling a part of themselves, completely blended in their mind with the fantasy role play. IFS calls this core central personality, the observer playing with the dolls, calls it the self with a capital S. But when we're completely absorbed in channeling, say, rock star musician Barbie, copyright 1986, forgetting the self altogether, we are, quote, blended with that part. Blended is the term that Richard Schwartz uses for this, this play. Blending with ourself with a part is not inherently good or bad. We do this all the time. The self blends with a part in times of stress, times of need, times of struggle, but also just to get things done sometime or to avoid hard emotions. An accident on a youth group trip, and suddenly I'm channeling my inner EMT because I watched way too many episodes of Emergency, and all that first aid training kicks in as I'm taking this kid to the hospital. I'm blended with a part of myself. This is what manager parts do. They protect us by being organized and disciplined, competent, but their protection can go too far. They can also protect us by being OCD, by being doped up, by being a guilt-tripping drill sergeant, can become too focused on a single goal, be hypercritical, fueling depression. Manager parts often think the self is not going to handle anything and they need to take over and blend with the self to take care of whatever needs to be done. Many religious systems are trying to avoid things that takes you off your path to enlightenment or avoid anything that disconnects you from God. Burdens, the weight each part must carry through life, take us off the path of following our true and highest self. They disconnect us from our own higher self. Sometimes these burdens can give us extreme impulses. Burdened parts don't experience this higher self or do not listen to the higher self. They wander around feeling disconnected from each other and our own higher self, just as many people feel disconnected from a higher energy outside themselves. Unburdening our internal parts can foster more connection within us, connection to our own better nature. This unburdening can spontaneously cause to behave in a more compassionate and caring way in the outside world and feel a deeper connection to a higher energy outside ourselves. IFS is practical, personal, yet very spiritual work. It can move us to work with our inner world in a more compassionate, caring way and move in the outer world in a more compassionate and caring way. In the words of Richard Schwartz, it is as if there's a piece of God, for a lack of better word, in each of our parts and in ourself. This is coming from a man who was raised as a secular Jewish atheist. Schwartz has taught IFS classes in the context of Buddhist temples, Christian monasteries. Many religious and spiritual disciplines can find common threads with this simple psychological technique that helps us to our higher inner self. In his therapy session, Schwartz over and over observed consistent qualities emerging as more of his patients' parts became unburdened and the true inner self emerged. Curiosity about a part as you discover it is essential to begin to understand it. We tend to reject some aspects of ourselves, but instead IFS asks us to be curious about even the most repugnant aspects of our own psyche. Calmness from parts not being triggered or activated by life's storms. Parts begin to trust the inner self can handle any situation. They don't need to take over. Creativity comes through as parts stop inhibiting us, trusting, allowing the inner self to create new and wonderful ideas. Clarity comes from we are not stuck in the past, reliving an earlier traumatic situation rather than creating a customized response to each new situation. Courage comes when our parts are not frozen in fear. Connectedness comes when we empathize with our own parts and within the self we observe in others. Compassion, as Schwartz has observed, spontaneously emerges as the self emerges. Compassion for our own injured parts, but also compassion for others who also carry their own burdens and trauma. Sometimes these parts become exiled. Exiles are suppressed parts of our psyche. There was once a little kid who pestered his little sister by popping the head off her Barbie doll and burning its hair. If you've not seen the movie, spoiler alert, this is how weird Barbie was born, with her hair all burned off and her joints out of place. I feel shame in admitting I was that evil little child and do my best to suppress the urge to pop the heads off of other people when they cut me off in traffic. However, today, if I find a tick on my body, that evil little doll mutilating kid comes out and I feel justified in smashing the parasite. That Barbie torturing exile still exists within me. I can heal this part by being curious about it, holding it, discovering that it felt its sister was getting all the attention. It had little compassion at the time, so thus no inhibition from being a jerk. This part felt justified in bullying my sister because it felt jealousy. Healing that jealousy won't come from suppressing this part or punishing it. It comes from understanding and caring about its original need. Weird Barbie would approve of this healing. Exiles can represent the most damaged parts of our psyche, the most repressed memories, the aspects of ourselves that we feel the most shame about and hurt around. We may use extreme behaviors to avoid engaging with our exiles. Other parts protect us from these exiles. They be manager parts, keeping us busy or distracted or doped up or worse. They may be what Schwartz calls a firefighter part. A hero, well, it thinks it's a hero anyway. It swoops in to protect us from the exile. Unfortunately, sometimes heroes are not very competent at what they do. I have a firefighter part, comes out sometimes. This firefighter is silent most of the time, but can swiftly turn to anger. Have you ever been underneath a sink, grinding your back on the edge of a cabinet, trying to fix some plumbing parts after the third trip to the hardware store. There's dust in your eye, it smells like mold in there, and finally you think you've got it all fixed. You turn on the valve and get sprayed in the face with filthy water once again. I'll begin to emit a string of cuss words that once embarrassed an actual sailor. Throwing wrenches and tools, busting the half-fixed plumbing pipe so the whole thing needs to be fixed again. Once this firefighter comes out, he's hard to put back. He'll hammer his way through the rest of the day, using way too much force for each task, swearing and cursing, grinding his teeth so bad he had to have a dentist fix him one time, heart racing toward a coronary. He's broken dishes and tools, torn up things that took hours to put back together. He won't stop and take a break because whatever it is needs to be fixed right now. He'll snap at everyone, cause arguments, and scare small children who do not need to see such an example of unhealthy adult behavior. I learned this angry behavior from my father and stepfather. This is how men meet challenges, my early brain learned. Men must force things to bend to their will. Masculinity, this part learned, is tied up with how effective one is in the world. And masculinity is threatened whenever we are ineffective at something, or injured or assaulted by yet another disobedient spraying pipe. This kind of fragile masculinity takes a lot of effort to maintain. These parts can have irrational beliefs. The spraying pipe is disobedient. This angry firefighter believes without a doubt that inanimate objects are bent on frustrating me. Every fragile vase put up on a shelf says, yeah, I'm going to dive off this shelf just to spite you. Cowabunga, crasho! Every pipe that won't screw together is just mocking me. The angry firefighter gets madder and madder as inanimate objects become more and more recalcitrant. Obviously, more force or a bigger hammer is the only solution to keep these inanimate objects in line. Now, being curious about this angry firefighter part, helping it separate from my true inner self, recognizing its burden of fragile, toxic masculinity has helped me be a lot more patient. No amount of dry intellectual engagement with the idea of toxic masculinity could heal this part. That academic exercise could plow the ground, but not sow the seed of healing. In the future, I hope to recruit some of my other parts to help the angry firefighter heal. It's still an ongoing struggle. I've drawn heavily from Richard Schwartz's book, No Bad Parts in the Service. Let me be clear. Schwartz does not try to function as a guru or a kind of spiritual leader in IFS. In fact, some years back, he had to check himself and his own egoistic motivations, step back from trying to take on that dangerous guru mantle. The Center for Self-Leadership is an organization that promotes these ideas and has a number of people promoting them and advancing research into these ideas. Schwartz and the other proponents of internal family systems therapy do not think that the only way to benefit from IFS is with a trained therapist. To be sure, if you have the opportunity to work with a therapist trained in internal family systems, it's going to be a boost. I was not able to locate a trained therapist in Columbia that was taking new patients, so I went online to the Center for Self-Leadership, selfleadership.org, to their database of trained IFS therapists, located one in St. Louis that was taking on new patients, and I was willing to work remotely. This work is an ongoing process. Like most things in psychology, it would take years, but the few early successes encourage me to push on. IFS is a model of the human brain. It's not the only effective way to engage our healing, but I found it a powerful approach to rapidly heal problems that have persisted for years. It's entirely possible to engage on this work, on your own or with a small group of trained lay people. YouTube is well supplied with credible psychologists leading IFS meditations and discussions on the subject, but I recommend you start with Richard Schwartz's book, No Bad Parts.